From viral fame to instant regret, blogger kicks Corgi and faces the consequences. Jake Mason had always thrived in the chaos of the spotlight. At 29, this Los Angeles-based social media influencer had perfected the art of stirring controversy for views. With millions of followers hanging on his every post, Jake knew exactly how to grab attention. Today, his latest stunt would take place in the heart of London, in front of Buckingham Palace, one of the most iconic locations in the world. The air was crisp, the streets were crowded with tourists, and Jake was ready to make his mark. He stepped out onto the bustling streets, dressed in a designer jacket and flashy sneakers, his phone already in hand. The crowd parted as he made his way toward the gates of the palace, the cameras of strangers clicking away as he passed by. He walked with the kind of confidence that only someone like him, someone who'd built a career on provocation, could muster. It was the kind of swagger that screamed, "I own this moment." With a sly grin on his face, Jake adjusted the angle of his phone's camera and began live streaming. "All right, guys," he said with his signature sarcastic tone, "I'm finally in London. Where's all this royal magic everyone's been hyping up? Oh wait, I think I found it." His camera zoomed in on the royal Corgi, trotting along beside the gates, its little paws barely touching the pavement. The dog was adorable, yes, but to Jake, it was just another target for his humor. The crowd around him didn't notice him at first, too busy admiring the Corgi and snapping their own pictures. But Jake knew, he was the star of the show. He was the one who would make this moment unforgettable. "Look at this, he's just another little spoiled dog, right?" he said into the camera, his words dripping with mockery. The crowd started to pay attention. Phones began to rise in the air, people recognizing Jake's face, realizing that something was about to go down. And Jake, well, he couldn't wait to deliver. He was about to turn Buckingham Palace, the home of centuries-old tradition, into his personal stage. Little did he know, he was about to cross a line that would change everything. As Jake continued to film, the crowd around him buzzed with excitement. His followers were watching, eagerly waiting for the chaos he was about to stir. The royal Corgi trotted happily alongside the palace gates, oblivious to the attention it was drawing. To the tourists, it was a moment to capture, a symbol of British royalty, loved and adored by millions. But to Jake, it was just another opportunity to push the boundaries and get a reaction. The dog's fluffy coat glistened in the sunlight as it pranced confidently, its tiny paws making no sound against the cobblestones. Jake smirked at the sight of it. The way people gushed over the dog, the way they fawned over a simple animal, it irritated him. He wasn't impressed. And in that moment, Jake's mind snapped into action. This, right here, was his perfect target. He stepped closer, raising his phone, the camera aimed directly at the Corgi. The crowd continued to admire the dog, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. With an exaggerated motion, Jake zoomed in on the Corgi, mocking its importance. "All right, guys," he said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The famous royal Corgi, folks. Look at him, so royal, so important, so overhyped." His grin widened, and a few of his followers laughed along, but others began to exchange uneasy glances. The atmosphere was shifting. Then, it happened. Jake took a deep breath and stepped forward, his smirk never leaving his face. With no warning, he raised his foot and kicked the royal Corgi. Not just a playful tap, but a real, forceful kick that sent the dog flying into the air. The sound of its yelp cut through the square, sharp and high-pitched, a noise so small yet so devastating. The crowd froze. Time seemed to stop. Phones fell to the ground as people gasped in disbelief. For a brief moment, no one knew what to do, no one knew what to say. Jake stood there, stunned by the silence. The dog lay on the ground, disoriented but unharmed. And then, the royal guard, unmoved for so long, took a single step forward. His boots struck the cobblestones with a force that echoed through the square. Jake hadn't expected this. The guard, trained to stand still, had just broken protocol. But what came next would change everything. The tension in the air shifted immediately. The crowd, once stunned into silence, now began to murmur as they watched the royal guard take a single, deliberate step forward. It was almost as if the moment had been frozen in time, until the guard moved. His boots struck the pavement with a force that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Jake's feet. The weight of his movement felt like a threat, but there was no anger in it, just a calm, unwavering resolve. The guard's rifle was still firmly in his grip, his posture unshakable, but something had changed. Jake's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He had kicked a royal dog, and now, the guard, the symbol of centuries of tradition, was reacting. But the real shock came when the guard didn't shout, didn't raise his voice, didn't even flinch. He simply took another step forward, his presence growing more imposing with every inch. It was calculated, controlled, deadly. Jake, still trying to maintain his composure, instinctively took a step back. His heart pounded in his chest. The live stream was still running, but his voice was no longer the confident tone he had started with. It faltered. "Whoa, guys, it's just a dog," he said, trying to laugh it off, but the sound of his own voice felt hollow, weak. He hadn't anticipated this. The guard's unblinking gaze didn't leave Jake's face. Every movement was deliberate, each step measured, like he was assessing Jake as a threat. The crowd had gone completely still. Phones were still recording, but no one was laughing anymore. No one was cheering him on. Instead, they were watching, waiting for the next move. And in that silence, Jake felt a shift. The power, the control he once had, was slipping away from him. He was no longer in charge of the narrative. The guard, towering over him, didn't need to say a word. His presence alone was enough. Jake had crossed a line. And as he stood there, caught in the intensity of the moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about respect. And Jake had just lost it, along with the control he once had. Jake's heart was racing now, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his actions. The guard's presence was suffocating, like the air around them had thickened into something tangible, pressing against him with an invisible force. The crowd, once entertained by his antics, had fallen silent, their phones still raised, capturing the unfolding drama. But no one was laughing anymore. The guard, unmoved and calm, continued to tower over Jake, and the realization hit him hard. This wasn't the performance he thought it was. He had been the star of this show, the one who commanded the attention, but now everything had changed. He tried to maintain his bravado, but the words caught in his throat. The guard's icy gaze was enough to freeze him in place, and the weight of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. The guard wasn't reacting with rage or anger. He was just doing his job perfectly. Jake tried to backpedal, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The whole moment felt surreal, like he had somehow crossed into another world, one where he was no longer in control. "Come on, man, it's just a joke," Jake said, trying to recover, but the words came out weak, desperate. His smug smile faltered as the guard took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. It was as if time itself had slowed. The air around Jake felt colder, heavier. The guard's presence was relentless. Jake wanted to step back, to run, but something held him there, an invisible force more powerful than his own arrogance. The crowd held its breath. No one stepped forward to help him. No one laughed or cheered. It was like Jake was now the outsider in a place he had once believed was his to control. The guard's face remained stoic, but his actions spoke louder than any words. Without hesitation, the guard reached out and grabbed Jake's wrist in a swift, unyielding motion. It was over. The crowd gasped as Jake tried to pull away, but it was too late. In an instant, Jake was spun around, his body forced into submission. He had no control now. His phone slipped from his hand, the live stream still recording, but the narrative was no longer his to command. The guards didn't say a word, but their movements were precise and cold. Jake's smugness, his sense of invincibility, had crumbled in front of the whole world. The last thing he saw before the handcuffs clicked into place was the royal guard, standing tall and unshaken, back at his post, just as he had been before. Jake's mind was racing, but his body was frozen. His phone had slipped from his hand and now lay forgotten on the ground, still recording. The crowd around him buzzed, but there was no sympathy in their voices, just disbelief and disgust. The royal guard had caught him, and it was over. There was no escaping it. The air was thick with the sound of clicking cameras, and Jake's heart pounded as he was pulled away from the scene. He had been the center of attention just moments ago, mocking the guard, acting like the whole world was his playground. But now, the world had shifted. His smug grin was gone, replaced by a panicked look as two officers approached. They didn't rush, didn't need to. Their calm, calculated movements said everything. Jake had no leverage left, no chance to fight back. The guard, still unmoving at his post, had simply done his duty. He hadn't been swayed by the cameras, the crowd, or Jake's antics. The man was a symbol of discipline, of tradition, and Jake had crossed a line. "You're under arrest for animal cruelty and assaulting a member of the Royal Guard," one of the officers said, his voice steady, cold. Jake's mind refused to process the words. Arrested? For what? He was a celebrity. He had millions of followers. He was untouchable. At least, that's what he had always believed. But as the handcuffs clicked into place, Jake realized how wrong he was. The officer didn't flinch as Jake struggled, yelling about his rights and how he'd call his lawyer. But no one was listening. The crowd parted as the officers led him away, some watching with a hint of schadenfreude, others recording the scene for posterity. The voices that had once cheered for him now whispered in disdain. His carefully curated world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The police car doors slammed shut behind him, and the world outside faded. Jake was no longer in control of the narrative. He was just another man who thought he could get away with anything, until the consequences arrived, swift and unforgiving. The videos would go viral. The memes would flood the internet. He had become a cautionary tale, a prime example of how quickly the mighty can fall when they forget the rules that govern respect and decency. The guard didn't speak a word. He simply returned to his post, unmoved and unshaken, a living symbol of discipline in a world that had just shown Jake Mason his limits. If you found this story shocking, we want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about what happened to Jake? Was the Royal Guard's reaction justified? Do you think there's a line that should never be crossed? Drop your comments below and let's get the conversation started. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking moments like this.